Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Ream Library. My name is Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors a range of conferences, lectures, discussions, conversations to foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. We also foster initiatives on Jewish-Christian understanding and work to enhance our understanding of Catholicism from a global perspective. Today, I'm really grateful to welcome Leo Guardado, who is a theologian from Fordham University, and he'll help us think about Christian responses to one of the most urgent issues in the world today, migration. We're living in an era of unparalleled movement of peoples, a great deal of it migration under pressure. Christians, like other people, have responded to that in a wide variety of ways. Some of those have admirably taken up the call to all Jews and Christians in the book of Exodus, "You shall not wrong the stranger or oppress him. Remember, you yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt." Others have retreated into an invented Christian nationalism that pretends that God actually prescribed the borders that define the world today. The work that Leo will be presenting today is deeply personal to him. He's from Chalatenango, El Salvador. As a 9-year-old boy, civil war compelled his mother to migrate with him to Los Angeles, California, where he grew up. Leo has worked in Tucson, Arizona borderlands with churches, dioceses, and NGOs, collaborating strategically across theological and political differences with communities committed to providing a humanitarian and pastoral response to those who are migrating. Educated at the University of Notre Dame in an interdisciplinary PhD in theology, and with the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the School of Global Affairs, he continues to collaborate at Fordham across departments and disciplines to further engage migrant communities. Today, he'll expand on research presented in his book, Church as Sanctuary, Reconstructing Refuge in an Age of Forced Displacement. I'm excited to hear him call our attention back to the tradition of the church as a site of refuge and protection, focusing on the 1980s sanctuary movement in the United States. So please join me in welcoming Leo.
Great. Well, thank you, and good afternoon. And it's so good to see so many students, so professors, thank you for bringing them or weaving this into your classes. It's my experience when college, oftentimes it was going to something that I was perhaps not interested in that I discovered just a gem of an idea that may have redirected my path. I'm going to be talking today about a topic that at times it's of great interest. It's in the news every day, and other times it's not, kind of in a lull moment. But this shifts on a dime, and this could shift, and it may be starting to shift, but depending on how elections go this fall, this topic of sanctuary could be back in the news every evening. You may find yourself someday in the position to decide or discern, what would I do in this case when someone shows up and needs some kind of protection? You may not, but you may know of someone. So wherever this may land, I hope that it bears fruit at some point one day. Special thanks, of course, to Audrey Sia for reaching out initially for my visit here, to Ruby Francis, who took care of a lot of logistics, and of course to Tom Landy for welcoming me and making this event possible, and the benefactors of the center as well. So I speak to you, as Tom already mentioned, not only as someone who engages in the craft of theology, but also as an immigrant, as someone who was forced to flee El Salvador in 1991, when I was 9, and who journeyed north for a month by land, and who snuck into this country through Tijuana, illegally, as they say, without papers. And when I began college at a Catholic institution, very much like Holy Cross, St. Mary's College in California, in the Bay Area, I was still undocumented. I mention this to locate myself in relation to today's subject matter. And I also want to say that there are some graphic images that accompany this presentation, which conveys the reality that forced displacement often exists in the midst of a violent context of life and of death. And I want to engage you in a topic that is not only a matter of ethics or of good citizenship. I think it is both of these things. But it's a matter of faith and what it means to live in relation to that mysterious force that some of us choose to call God. And like God talk, theology, which can be controversial, so too is the protection of lives whom governments deem repulsive. And true to the etymology of the word, they are repelled, driven back, rejected from the body politic. Pope Francis recently weighed in with a piercing clarity on the mass expulsion of migrants worldwide. And so by way of introducing this topic today, I want to spend some time with a message that he delivered on August 28th, 2024, which took the place of his Wednesday audience in St. Peter's Square in Rome. So this is just 2 or 3 weeks ago. He begins by saying that he will not provide the usual catechesis, so the usual religious instruction, Sunday school you could call it, or Wednesday school, but that instead he wants hearers to think of the people who are, quote, crossing seas and deserts to reach a land where they can live in peace and safety, close quote. And he titles his remarks, Catechesis, Seas and Desert. And then he goes on to explain what he means by these words and the hostile geographies that they represent. By sea, he says, quote, I also mean ocean, lake, river, all the insidious bodies of water that so many brothers and sisters all over the world are forced to cross to reach their destination. And desert, he adds, is not only that of sand and dunes, of rocks, but also those inaccessible and dangerous territories, such as forests, jungles, steppes, where migrants walk alone, left to their own devices. These, Francis makes clear, become cartographies of death for people on the move. And while some are predominantly featured on the news regularly, like the Mediterranean, most of these modern wildernesses remain unknown to us. And so perhaps one of the most well-known is the Mediterranean Sea, which in the words of Francis has become a cemetery. And since 2014, the International Organization for Migration has recorded about 29,000 deaths and disappearances in the Mediterranean as migrants attempt to cross it in overloaded inflatable boats. They estimate that many more sink and go just simply unrecorded. So it's actually impossible to make an accurate account of death. The coast guards of European countries make every attempt to prevent these boats from arriving on European soil. So instead of helping the boats, these governments do whatever they can to keep them at sea. Pope Francis says the following in his response, quote, it must be said clearly, there are those who work systematically and with every means possible to repel migrants. And this, when done with awareness and responsibility, is a grave sin, close quote. So often, I think Christians think of the category of sin as a personal, individual matter. But when it comes to migration, it is also a social and communal matter, and certainly it is an ecclesial matter, something that directly affects what it means to be church. Francis also calls the deserts where migrants cross a cemetery and tells us that those who perish there do not undergo a natural death. Rather, these deaths have a purpose. They are socially and politically constructed deaths. Quote, in time of satellites and drones, there are migrant men, women, and children that no one must see. They are hidden, close quote. I want to emphasize that it's not simply that no one sees these deaths, but that they are engineered so that no one must see them. Even if governments succeed in making us not see how death is engineered, sea and desert become faithful witnesses to death. In Genesis, after Cain kills Abel, it is from the ground that blood cries out to God. That's Genesis 4. Creation contains the corpses, the fragments, the remains of all who have been made to perish. And it renders testimony to God. On the screen, you see a map. This is the map of the southwest border. And in the map, like drops of blood, there are 114 red pins for each of the human remains found in the Sonoran Desert since this January 2024 at the border between Arizona and Mexico. So that is just this year up to now. But it is not only natural creation that witnesses these forced deaths. God too witnesses them, for God is there with the poor who are forcibly displaced. So in that same general audience that Francis, where he gave his talk on August 28th, he says, God's self crosses the sea and the desert. God shares in the migrants' tragedy. God suffers with them, weeps and hopes with them. And then he adds, the Lord is with our migrants in the Mare Nostrum, in our sea. The Lord is with them, not with those who repel them. It is tempting, I think, for us to simply affirm that God is everywhere and with everyone. But there's also a truth in the hard news that God is drowning in the sea, dying of thirst in the desert, and that it is we, a people, who may have a hand in these deaths. God is not with those who repel migrants, Francis emphasizes. And if we can allow some of this statement to have some kind of truth to it, then it behooves those of us who call ourselves Christian, of whatever variety, to ask whether we repel them both, migrant and God, God and migrant. For essentially what Francis is saying is that to repel one is to repel the other. And so Francis asks us to stop the ever-increasing restrictive laws, the militarization of borders, he says, the rejection of peoples. And he asks, extend safe and legal access routes for migrants and provide refuge for those who flee from war, violence, persecution, and various disasters. He ends that Wednesday audience talk by thanking the Good Samaritans in the 5 continents who rescue and save migrants, who are not simply doing humanitarian work, but fighting for humanity itself, for a civilization that is not defined by indifference and rejection. And he invites us to assist them in every way we can. And so this extended introduction into our current moments provides the urgent context for thinking about how the church, the community of people who identify as the followers of Jesus in one form or another, and beyond that, I would say, all who do the will of God, of a God of life, how they can serve as a refuge, or how we can serve as a refuge, an asylum, a sanctuary, for persons who are forced to migrate and then who are repelled either at the borders of the country or from within the heart of our cities through deportation. So in the time that I have left, I will first focus on one of the most beautiful responses to mass displacement, the 1980s sanctuary movement, or ministry, as they called it, that started in southern Arizona and that spread across North America. I will then explain some of the history of the concept and the practice of asylum or sanctuary in churches, how it became part of the church's canon law, so the legislative kind of body of the church, its rules, and how it disappeared in the 1980s. And these 2 sections will be the longest, and in the third, shorter section, I'll invite you to consider that becoming a community of refuge is holy work, what Christians may call salvific work, and that it's actually constitutive of what it means to be a community of faith who walks with the God of the poor in a world where human displacement is increasing exponentially. And just to give you a slight figure, in 2012, there were about 45 million forcibly displaced persons. So last year, there's close to 115, 120 million. So from 45 to over 115 million in the course of 12, 13 years. Where will it be in 2040? We don't know. But this is growing exponentially worldwide. So the question is, what are we ready to do when necessary? So part 1, the 1980s sanctuary ministry or movement. On July 4th, 1980, a group of 26 Salvadorans fleeing the U.S.-sponsored social, political, and economic crisis of their country was attempting to cross southern Arizona with the hope of finding refuge in these United States. The previous day, 2 Mexican coyotes had left most of the group stranded in an isolated and arid region of the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument Desert, which is where you see the red dot. That's where they got lost, where summer temperatures easily surpass 120 degrees. As it became clear that the Mexican coyotes were not coming back, some of the men decided to venture forth in search of water, leaving about 10 of the women behind with a Salvadoran coyote who had organized the trip from El Salvador. So on the evening of July 5th, a day later, Border Patrol discovered the men who left to find water, but 3 of them had already died of thirst. The rest of the group who had remained behind was not found until the morning of July 6th, so 3 days later. 7 of those 10 were dead. In total, 13 of the original 26 survived. 3 were never found, and the rest perished in the desert wilderness. One of those who survived is Dora Rodriguez, and she's a friend of mine, and she lives in the Tucson region. A few years ago, she began to tell her story publicly. And I would like to show you just 2 minutes of a video that brings to life the harrowing story that is at the root of the sanctuary ministry or movement.
This photograph of 19-year-old Dora Rodriguez was splashed on the front page of newspapers across the globe in July 1980. A gruesome scene, bodies scattered around her. 26 El Salvadorans fleeing the country's civil war crossed the border into the Arizona desert.
Oh, yes. Yeah, this is me.
Half of them died.
My poor mom, it was all over the country, of course. But my name was in the list of the people who died.
Back home in El Salvador, Dora's name was on yet another list, a target of the death squads. When 3 of her friends were captured and killed, she fled. She escaped death there, but her hopes and dreams of a life in the U.S. nearly ended in unimaginable horror in the Arizona desert.
And I remember like it was yesterday. It's just amazing how that can stay with you after all these years. I couldn't get up, I couldn't move. I couldn't even open my eyes. All I hear is screaming, yelling, help me, help me. When it was so silent around us, because almost everybody was dead. And I woke up to the sound of helicopters and horses. And I remember waking up to a face of a border patrol. I remember him forever. And he told me, don't fall asleep, don't go to sleep. Please stay with me, stay with me. My heart hurts because this is never gonna stop.
As she now, some 4 decades later, watches others come in caravans, she says she feels helpless.
And it's very humbling to me because why would I tell him not to try when I did try, right? I have no right to tell him not to.
A few months before this incident, Archbishop Oscar Romero had been assassinated while saying Mass in San Salvador. And some people in the U.S. began to ask, what is going on in that small country in Latin America? And 6 months after this desert tragedy, 4 American churchwomen, Sister Dorothy Kazel, Sister Ida Ford, Sister Maura Clark, and Jean Donovan, would be killed by the Salvadoran government. It is in these months that more and more Salvadorans began to arrive in the U.S., fleeing the war. The survivors of the desert tragedy were taken to a nearby hospital in Tucson, and then they were arrested to begin the deportation process back to war in El Salvador. The Tucson Ecumenical Council, a group of different churches that gathered together, and which included the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tucson, they decided to bail out the survivors from the prisons, the detention centers for deportation, and to provide them with food, with clothing, with shelter, and with legal services. And that's how Dora was able to stay in the U.S. And just to let you know, a few years ago, she opened a shelter right at the border for migrants who are crossing over. So in a way, her story is now full circle, working at the border for others who are crossing. So as more and more Salvadorans and Guatemalans arrived, faith communities and people of goodwill started to organize to create awareness about why people were crossing the border. And they also continued to bail out Central Americans. So the following summer, moved forward a year, the Task Force in Central America, this was a subgroup of the Tucson Ecumenical Council, these churches working together, they raised the money to bail out about 115 asylum seekers from a detention center that was located in the middle of the desert. It's called El Centro Detention Center. And they relocated these asylum seekers to churches throughout Tucson and Los Angeles. However, just a couple of months later, there were hundreds more migrants in the detention center that also needed to be bailed out. People literally started to put their houses as collateral to raise the money to bail out people. But, of course, something had to change. Additionally, they realized that out of the 7,000 asylum applications that were submitted in the year 1980 for Central Americans, none had been granted by the government, even though war was taking place. So it became clear that a different strategy was needed, more than just bailing out asylum seekers. A different strategy so that they would not be sent back to their death and to war. And so here enters Jim Corbett. He is a Quaker, or a friend, a Harvard-trained philosopher who also happened to be a goat herder in the desert, and who was already involved with some of the local clergy. And he suggested, quote, in order to save lives, the group needed to aid Central American refugees to avoid capture, close quote. Corbett had already been assisting refugees avoid capture, and he had been providing his own house as a temporary place of refuge. And an initial effort to help one detained refugee had evolved into more direct assistance to others on their journey. Corbett had previously talked with a detention center officer he was trying to communicate to this officer what was happening in Central America. The officer simply said, quote, you can't get involved or relate to them personally, or you'll just lose your mind. She said, I'm not responsible for what's happening to them. I just do my job, close quote. Reflecting on these words, Corbett later wrote, quote, she's quite young and does not realize that it's been said before, close quote. The allusion for Corbett was to the Nazi deportation of Jews and to the officers' self-defense during the Nuremberg trials, where they argued that they were simply following orders. In a statement to the National Council of Churches in 1981, Corbett said the following, if the churches continue to ignore the Salvadorans' desperate need to avoid capture, the American public will continue to see the refugees rather than their persecutors as illegals. Much more than the fate of the undocumented refugees depends on the religious community's participation and leadership in helping them avoid capture. If the right to aid fugitives from government-sponsored terror is not upheld in action by churches, regardless of the cost in terms of imprisoned clergy, punitive fines, and exclusion from government-financed programs, the loss of many other basic rights of conscience will certainly follow. No one who lives in this country can have missed that lesson. Close quote. Toward the end of 1981, Corbett approached Reverend John Fife, the pastor of Southside Presbyterian Church, to consider sheltering asylum seekers whom Corbett and others were helping across the border so that they would not be captured. And so the elders, the leaders of Southside, the congregation, they voted in support of the request. And some in the church then began to transport Central Americans from the border to the church, where they were now starting to live for weeks or months. By January of 1982, a congregation-wide discernment whether to continue this work, though, had to take place. The discernment process forced the congregants, the parishioners, I'm going to call it, to decide whether they were willing to endure the consequences of becoming a public sanctuary church. Continuing to keep quiet and hidden from the public, what they called their sanctuary ministry, actually made it vulnerable to government shutdown. So the church took a vote, and they voted 79 in support and 2 against becoming a sanctuary or a church that provided refuge to Central Americans. One of the congregants who was opposed to the decision wrote to the FBI the following day to inform them of the church's actions. Southside Presbyterian, along with churches in other states, then chose March 24th, 1982, the anniversary of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, as the day to go public, that the church was, quote, a sanctuary of God for the oppressed of Central America, close quote. Within months, the sanctuary ministry started to become a national sanctuary movement. And by the mid-1980s, there were hundreds of places of worship, including universities, that were part of a network of sites of refuge that extended from southern Mexico, right at the border with Guatemala, to Canada, and from San Francisco to Boston. And as time went on, the network started to use United Nations guidelines for screening asylum seekers in Central America and in southern Mexico in order to prioritize the cases whom they felt really needed to be transported into the United States and away from the Mexico-US border. And so persons and families who ended up in church communities then began a legal process in due time of applying for some kind of protection, if possible, from the government, with the support of the local community who had taken them in. Said monasteries, convents, universities, churches of all kinds across the country. For Corbett and others involved with the sanctuary movement, people of faith and goodwill did not just have a moral imperative to protect persons whose lives were threatened if returned to their country, but through what they called civil initiative, he felt that they could contribute to holding the government accountable to the international standards that were meant to protect refugees, which they believed that the government was violating. The hope was that in time, when asylum cases were no longer arbitrarily being denied because of the State Department's political interests in Central America, after all, the U.S. funded the war in my country of El Salvador, that qualified lawyers would then be able to help Salvadorans and Guatemalans apply for asylum and maybe, just maybe, have a fair hearing. So Corbett, Five, and borderland communities believed that what they were doing through sanctuary was civil initiative, civilians taking initiative to uphold the fundamental norms of a human society, even against government threats against those norms. The concept of civil initiative was directly tied to the principles set forth by the Nuremberg trials that began to codify crimes against humanity. And perhaps one of the most widely known principles is Principle 4, which states, quote, the fact that a person acted pursuant to order of his or her government or their government or of a superior does not relieve them from responsibility under international law, provided a moral choice was in fact possible to them. Now, Corbett was aware of the disputed nature of the Nuremberg principles and the degree to which they were legally binding, and that the very concept of international norms and frameworks in relation to their theoretical impingement on notions of national sovereignty. I mean, he was the son of a lawyer, after all. So he was aware that these were like frontier territories of law. Nonetheless, he believed that in their grassroots practice, universal norms of humanity could be woven into the domestic social fabric. Civil initiative for them was a socially constructive means that could organically build a more just and nonviolent society by uniting the global and the local through that practice of sanctuary for refugees who were being sent back to war. The guiding principles of civil initiative were fundamentally a version of Mahatma Gandhi's conceptualization and practice of satyagraha, a method for addressing social conflict. More particularly, sanctuary was a form of Gandhi's constructive program, which, by the way, was also at the heart of Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision in the civil rights era and the boycotts. So the constructive program was focused on community-led initiatives that began to incarnate in history ways of constructing a nonviolent society from the ground up. For Gandhi and for Corbett, the constructive program, which in the borderlands became actualized as the practice of sanctuary, was the basis for a more humanizing society. Through this generative force of refuge, persons and communities were liberated unto a microcosm of what society could become as a communion of humanity across borders. The constructive work of sanctuary was the nonviolent means for local church communities to encounter both prophetic and civil power that could transform the violence of a political system. Sanctuary essentially became a way of being in the world, constructing community anew, in communion with those whose humanity was being violated. Sanctuary movement lasted about a decade, and at its height in the mid-1980s, it was a network of over 500 communities nationwide who were providing refuge. But remember that a person who called the FBI the day later and said, like, yeah, so my church is gonna do this. Well, in 1985, the government put on trial for human smuggling 2 Roman Catholic priests, 1 religious sister, a Presbyterian minister, and 7 lay workers, all who claimed to be acting out of religious conviction and in accord with international law. John Five and Jim Corbett were part of this group. But part of how we got there and the government taking them to trial is because since December of 1983, a year after they went public, the FBI had infiltrated, put under surveillance, and recorded churches that were part of the sanctuary movement under a program that the FBI called Operation Sojourner. And this information was used against the sanctuary workers in the trial. The name that the FBI chose for the person who infiltrated the sanctuary ministry and the churches, the name the FBI gave this person was Jesus, Jesus. An odd sense of humor by the government. In the trial, some were found guilty of, quote, alien smuggling. Most received suspended sentences or house arrest. When the trial finished, the sanctuary churches turned right around and opened a lawsuit against the government in response to the government's persecution of persons involved with sanctuary in the borderlands. By 1990, the Department of Justice decided to settle with the plaintiffs. This is called the ABC Agreement. And by the way, there's a different story, but I came in 1991 with my mother without papers, as I mentioned, and we came just days before kind of a privilege expired of those who arrived in a certain time, and so my mother was able to apply for some tent protected status. So indirectly, I am here with you because of the way and you can say the ripple effects of churches that decided to do sanctuary, sue the government. With the settlement in 1990, sanctuary communities and their supporters were essentially vindicated, we could say, in the truth of their arguments and the practices of sanctuary. So while the 1980s became a historic decade for the emergence of church sanctuary in civil society, I mean, it was all over the news. And there were a lot of Catholic churches that were part of it. But within Roman Catholicism, really, this was the decade when the right of sanctuary in churches disappeared. It was removed from the code of canon law. And so now I'm going to shift from the 1980s to the 300s. We're going to go way back in time to talk about how did this even become part of the church tradition. So a bit of history here, so try to stay with me. So I turn now to part 2, the emergence and the disappearance of the right of asylum in churches. So the origins of church sanctuary are in the 4th century, and they illustrate that it was understood as a religious and a pastoral response to persons in need of protection from violence and death. While the 4th century bishops could theoretically presume upon some ancient Greek and Roman traditions that sacred spaces were places of refuge, the fact that there were confrontations with imperial authorities in this century illustrates that they protected persecuted persons because they felt it was the church's duty, its religious and pastoral duty, to advocate and intercede on their behalf, not because it was somehow allowed by the Roman Empire. And so despite the vast, and I'll say vast differences between a church in the 4th century Roman Empire and the realities of the 21st century, the need for protection is a constant then and now, as are the political and legal tensions to which refuge in the church or in churches gives rise. The earliest reference to what we call church asylum or church sanctuary comes from this council of bishops called the Council of Serdica. It's a council held in the year 343, and it gathered about 170 bishops from both the eastern and the western parts of the empire, who attempted to reconcile various political, ecclesiastical, and theological conflicts that were taking place, a lot having to do with the nature of Christ. Within a broader context of determining these things and norms for bishops, what they could and couldn't do, and how they could interact with each other and with the courts of the empire, it is there that we find that the responsibility that bishops have to intercede for condemned and persecuted persons. And so we have this Canon 8, and a canon basically means rule. Okay, so rule number 8 of this council states, a bishop should make his intercession for those who are oppressed by disadvantages in life, or the afflicted widow or exploited orphan. And since it often happens that those who suffer a wrong, or who as offenders are condemned to exile, or an island, or at any rate receive some sentence that they flee to the mercy of the church, they are to be given relief, and forgiveness is to be asked for them without hesitation, close quote. So that phrase toward the end, to flee to the mercy of the church, that is arguably the first ecclesiastical reference, church reference to sanctuary or asylum, within what the late theologian Hamilton Hess calls an ecclesiastical rule of law. So this is before canon law. It would eventually be codified into what we now know as canon law in the following centuries. And again, canon law is like the legal system of the Roman Catholic Church. The text conveys the conviction of these early church leaders, bishops, that the tradition of refuge should encompass a wide scope of who could seek the church's intervention before the Roman Empire. So a bishop's duty was to give relief, it says, and it concerned persons who were oppressed by any number of social, economic, or political reasons. Particular attention was given to those who had actually been condemned to exile. And in the 4th century, exile could serve as an alternative to the death penalty, especially for the more privileged classes. So a condemnation to exile was a forced displacement. You think of it as a forced deportation to avoid death. In such cases, whether it was because the accused suffered a wrong or because they were in fact offenders, criminals, if they fled to the church was tasked with interceding and seeking their forgiveness before the emperor without hesitation, as the Canon 8 says. So that those who were oppressed by disadvantages in life, who were afflicted, and who were exploited were placed together with the condemned in the canon's instructions for bishops, points to the fact that there was a variety of persons who found themselves in need of the intercession of bishops before the courts, and to the way in which such categories in real life are often interrelated. And so, canonically speaking, so talking in terms of the rules set forth here, the bishop's personal involvement with persons whose life was threatened was not some optional extra demand that a bishop could or could not take upon himself, but rather it was a constitutive dimension of his faith and his duty as a bishop. I think this is important to keep in mind because currently in the Roman Catholic Church, bishops generally will not touch the word sanctuary. And in the 1980s, only about 5 bishops publicly supported the ministry or movement. The Council of Serdica established a framework for how ecclesiastical leaders were to respond to the practice of persons taking refuge in the church. The council did not establish the practice of sanctuary in the church, for it was already happening at the time of the bishops' gathering in Serdica. The bishops, though, did recognize and affirm the legitimacy of a merciful response to this practice. The intercession of the bishop also meant the active protection of the refugee from being apprehended by local authorities until a solution to the critical life-altering situation could be found in the court system. In the 340s, when the canons or the rules of Serdica were agreed upon, there were no protections that would theoretically keep the local authorities of the Roman Empire from entering a church and extracting whoever had taken refuge. Just like now, when ICE agents can force their way into any location they want, including churches. There's this thing called a sensitive location memo from 2011 that essentially says to ICE agents, you may not want to go into a church or a university. Bad PR. So sensitive location. Don't just barge in there. But technically they can, and they have the right to do so, just like in the 4th century. Retaining refugees who had already been condemned then, in the 4th century, was contrary to the secular law and even constituted concealment of wrongdoers. There were no guarantees of life for those who took refuge or for the bishops who interceded. Throughout the 4th century and into the 5th, what we now refer to as asylum in churches or sanctuary in churches was simply referred to as fleeing to the church, or more specifically, to the mercy of the church. The reference was not simply to fleeing to a church, as in an individual church building or a cathedral, but to the church, to the whole community of what church points to. In the latter half of the 4th century, this practice would be further established through the preaching and the personal involvement of some of the key bishops and theologians of the time, including Ambrose of Milan, Gregory of Nazianzus, Basil of Caesarea, John Chrysostom, and then Augustine of Hippo, who has some wonderful homilies on this topic. Let's just briefly take one example. At the end of the 4th century, John Chrysostom provides one of the most powerful reflections on taking refuge in the church. 2 of his homilies from the year 399 concern this consul to the Emperor Arcadius. So his name was Eutropius, and after he had a political downfall with the emperor and was condemned, he took refuge in the church of Santa Sophia in Constantinople. Chrysostom points out that Eutropius had fought to eliminate this practice of taking refuge in churches, and that he had succeeded to some degree with laws that he was able to pass against the practice of asylum in churches in the year 390, only to then find himself the beneficiary of what he had previously persecuted as someone in power in the legal system. And so in the first homily given while Eutropius was in the church, because Eutropius took sanctuary there, Chrysostom says, "In thy misfortune I do not abandon thee," it's an older translation, "and now when thou art fallen, I protect and tend thee. And the church which you treated as an enemy has opened her bosom and received thee into it." In the homily, the bishop asks those at the cathedral to hasten to produce some fruit of mercy by going and imploring the merciful God, but more importantly, practically at the moment, to going and interceding also with the emperor. So I want to emphasize 2 key points about the origins of sanctuary. First, bishops looked at the status of individuals who took refuge in the church in terms of the oppressions, the persecutions, and the condemnations that threatened their life and humanity. And they saw the church's responsibility as one of needing to historically, in history, manifest the mercy of God through the defense of those who sought refuge. And second, They consistently rejected the view that they could carry out this religious duty of intercession and protection without also risking themselves as bishops, as ecclesiastical leaders. Risks that could include imprisonment or worse. By the time of John Chrysostom in the late 300s, the whole of the church was being invited to intercede. So not just the bishop, but the whole congregation was being invited to go and intercede, to risk themselves and face possible consequences before the empire's courts. Just to finish off this section, let me tell you that the practice of refuge in the church would not be legalized as a positive right within civil codes until decades later, around the year 430. These laws would essentially become the legal codification of a practice or a custom that had already been taking place for about 100 years. As history goes on in the Middle Ages, there's no linear progression of the legal or canonical right of refuge or right of asylum in churches. It's a tradition that adapted with restrictions, with possibilities, immunities that kings gave to certain churches and regions, and it really depended upon the politics of a given time and place. Moving forward to the 20th century, because by the late 20th century, ecclesiastical leaders, bishops essentially, they questioned the necessity and even the validity of having references to refuge in the church within canon law. And so these discussions in the late 70s and early 80s paved the way for the canonical erasure of this tradition in the post-Vatican II church. So the many, many centuries that sanctuary or asylum existed as a recognized right within kingdoms and empires, this had led the church to depend on the legal recognition of this tradition for its existence. And I believe it tragically eroded the early Christian roots that asylum or sanctuary in churches was a religious and pastoral duty that transcended any codification of it as a civil law. The ecclesiastical recognition of sanctuary or asylum in the church formally existed until the early 1980s. So the last version of the Code of Canon Law from the year 1917 says the following: churches enjoy the right of asylum, which implies that criminals seeking refuge therein may, except in cases of urgent necessity, not be taken out without the consent of the ordinary, or at least of the rector of the church. Close quote. The current code of code of law of the Roman Catholic Church, which was last revised in 1983, does not explicitly prohibit refuge in the church. It just no longer mentions that it ever existed. It doesn't mention this tradition. It was literally erased. References to asylum or sanctuary were taken out. I believe that there's a need to discern whether, in fact, church asylum or church sanctuary is no longer needed in the Code of Canon Law of the Roman Catholic Church. Not as a civil legal right, because that doesn't make sense. Division of church and state, modern nation states. Not as a civil legal right, but as a principle and a practice of the church for welcoming, protecting, promoting, and integrating. 4 key verbs that Pope Francis keeps using. For welcoming, protecting, promoting, and integrating those who flee to the mercy of the church. So let me go on to the shorter last part of this talk. The church as a refuge and asylum for migrants. In the United States, even some of the most pastorally grounded Roman Catholic bishops and clergy are hesitant to associate with the church's tradition of asylum or sanctuary, which points to the need to continue grounding this long tradition in the church's own lived history and theology. In the modern nation state, the church certainly cannot invoke sanctuary as a civil legal right, as I already said. But the fundamental principle of sanctuary as a response in faith to those who seek refuge must not be forgotten. Some Christian denominations, not the Catholic ones, but some, or Roman Catholic, but some Christian denominations have begun to codify anew the principle and practice of sanctuary. The legislative bodies of the United Methodist, Evangelical Lutheran, Presbyterian USA, and Episcopal churches, among others, have institutionalized the possibility of providing church sanctuary as an expression of their pastoral and religious commitment. At a minimum, their bishops or ecclesiastical leaders have left the door open so that a local congregation, a local church, a local parish can decide for themselves where they stand regarding the possibility of providing sanctuary for someone who seeks it. So it's not their leader who necessarily will decide for them, which is normally how it happens right now in Roman Catholicism. A bishop will either prohibit this from even being discussed in parishes. The Episcopal Church, in particular, has even developed sanctuary insurance for parishes. Guess what? Pay $100 a year and you will be covered for $100,000. Seems like a pretty creative way of addressing this reality, because you may in fact need some funds for legal stuff that may come about if the government decides to come after you for protecting someone or people or families. Okay? But this allows them to actually do what they feel they need to do as a community of faith. I like this quote here on the left. This from Mother Paula Jackson. This coverage allows us to fulfill a promise to be with some of our parishioners who are most at risk, those who are undocumented migrants and in fear of their lives if they should be deported. I am thrilled with this coverage. At only $100 per year, it shows that church insurance has our back. It almost sounds like a sales pitch, but it's brilliant, I think. $100. Get every parish to pay $100, you'll be covered for $100,000. Have them pay $200, be covered for $200,000. You know, there are creative ways of actually responding to need and being, I think, good stewards of finances, which I think we also need to be. So certainly there are risks for living into this tradition of being church. However, fidelity to God and neighbor and to the sacramental horizon that holds them together continues to challenge we, the church, to become a living sanctuary, a site of refuge that unequivocally communicates the merciful love of God. Church asylum or church sanctuary is constructed by each local community that, like living stones, lives into the theological conviction of being a people gathered in faith, hope, and love, who cannot become bystanders to the lives of the poor, displaced, and persecuted in their midst. The heart of sanctuary is the community that provides refuge and accompaniment. When the government's persecution communicates to persons that they do not belong in society, we hear that a lot, and we're hearing it a lot these days, that they must be expelled, that they will be rounded up. The actions of sanctuary communities can be a counter-narrative that affirms their life and their dignity. When an individual or a family takes refuge in a sanctuary community, the walls of the building may provide some form of protection, but more importantly, members of the community protect by keeping watch within the sanctuary day and night. It is a vigil of sorts. By being present, the community becomes part of the internal journey that persons in sanctuary are undergoing as they navigate the profound questions of where they are in this place of sanctuary, who they are in relation to a community that has recognized the truth of their threatened existence, that their lives will be fundamentally altered adversely if they are deported, possibly even be killed. Let me finish this talk by referencing the story of the late Father Paul Crowley, a Jesuit who was among the hundreds of religious leaders who participated in the ministry of sanctuary in the 1980s. In 1988, during a visit to El Salvador, fellow Jesuits asked Crowley to accompany Vicente to the U.S. border because his life was in danger and Vicente's wife and 4 children had already been killed. They said, it'll be a quick trip, no big deal. He said, okay, all right. He writes about this. Okay, well, I'll do it. It was a trip that was supposed to take a few days and a couple of easy plane rides to Mexico City and then to Tijuana. But this became a month-long journey of faith that entailed evading Mexican federal police and eventually U.S. Border Patrol. In Mexico, Crowley and friends traveled about 2,000 kilometers in buses. They stayed at various churches. They slept outside in the cold. They picked up a family of 2 Salvadoran women and 3 young girls who also needed to find refuge in the U.S. And finally, right before attempting to cross into the U.S. on May 1st, 1988, this whole group that grew as they came north, they all prayed together in a small chapel along the U.S.-Mexican border to ask for God's protection, which is what so many migrants do. He essentially unknowingly became a migrant facing the same dangers. Later that day, they crossed, and they made it to a sanctuary church in Tucson. And eventually, Crowley and Vicente made their way to Los Angeles, to a Jesuit-affiliated sanctuary community for Central American refugees, where Vicente was being expected. After the month-long journey, Father Paul Crowley wrote the following: "More important than all of these experiences and after effects, I feel that I've been changed. Something has happened, the full implications of which I'm still trying to figure out. This experience has touched me at the core of my being. It has forced me, as few other experiences have, to take possession of my own personhood, perhaps because these weeks have been partly concerned with saving the life of another person. The experience of these weeks has expanded my North American horizon to include an entire continent and its suffering people. Furthermore, these weeks have forced me to confront and accept the grace and love of God in ways that I never could have anticipated or planned. It has been a trial, and a blessing. Sanctuary, then and now, has to do with saving the life of another person and having one's own life transformed in the process. It is an experience that, amid shared trials, opens persons and communities unto the mysterious and salvific grace of that which some of us choose to call God. It is in the shared experience of refuge that we may come face to face with the holy, and that we may just find our deepest identity and our deepest call as a people of God. So I leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions, and I just ask if people use the mic in the center primarily because it's just being recorded for people who will listen later, and the mic will pick up the questions. So, some brave soul.
You got a lot of historical data, 1980s, early church. I just invite you to step back and where does this land on you? What questions do you have? Practically, it could be about the text or sanctuary, or just at a more kind of existential level. So anything goes. Hi.
So in the United States, there's a legal definition of an asylum seeker who qualifies for asylum. But how would you respond? What makes someone an asylum seeker? How do we know whether someone needs refuge or deserves refuge?
Thank you. Thank you. It gets us into the world of definitions, of categories, of concepts, and how concepts either reflect or do not the reality on the ground. I used migrants in the title of the talk. I talked about seeking asylum or asylum seekers. I used refugee in reference to the 4th century, and I purposely wove all of these into one. So I would not make a good lawyer. And purposefully, I would say I do that because some of the definitions for who counts as a refugee are still reflecting a reality that may have been true in the middle of the 20th century, that in one sense may or may not reflect, and some would argue do not reflect, the shifting realities of the world. Some would say from a decolonial perspective, they were actually created for a European population. Many of those coming are actually not from Europe anymore, but from the global south. And so we could take different approaches to this, but I would just say it is important to be able to adjudicate priorities. That is the job of lawyers, and even in the 1980s, when so many people were coming over, they said, like, okay, how do we discern who to cross over? And they took UN kind of protocols that they began to follow, and they got some critique for that. I was born in El Salvador in a war. I came over with my mom. We were just illegal aliens. I mean, that's what we were. We did not receive recognition as political refugees. Some would say, well, you were fleeing an actual war. Yeah, but I mean, we weren't granted that. Did we seek asylum? Eventually, we applied for that, but that was not our intention. Our intention was, my mom said, let's not my son be drafted at age 10. So I was 9.5. So that was the reason. Many of those who come over now, I mean, I think of farmers. El Salvador and Central America is one of the fastest desertifying regions in the world. So if you're into climate change, a farmer who now corn doesn't grow and doesn't have food and used to sell that corn to make some money and make a livelihood and now can't, they don't show up at the border or before a judge to say, well, I am a climate refugee, which would be a whole nother category within this legal spectrum. No, they're like, I'm poor, I got no money, I need food. So I'm not giving you a definition, and I'm purposely, in a way, saying I'm using all of these concepts because part of what needs to happen, I think, is from the humanities, in one sense, continue to complexify, is that a word, complexify? But to make more complex, these categories that we've inherited that have really helped us to adjudicate who deserves, I think you used the word deserve, who deserves and who doesn't deserve. Who can come in and who can't. But the realities on the ground often do not reflect the categories that we try to impose upon that reality. So I think of anyone who comes into the United States for reasons that threaten their life, and poverty, I would say, is one of the greatest threats to lives worldwide. Poverty exacerbates all kinds of other factors, intersectional kind of factors of gender, class and politics and so forth. I don't see why they would not be called persons who are fleeing or seeking asylum. Asylum, from asylon in the Greek, means a place where you will not be extracted, plundered, where theft of yourself will not happen. And so, what's a place of asylum? Who's an asylum seeker? Someone who's seeking some form, I would say, of health, of life, of home. That's a very non-legal response to your precise question, and I just saying, like, almost purposefully pushing back on the categories. But thank you nonetheless for the invitation to think along those lines. Yeah.
Take one more.
Great. Sure.
Hi, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on sort of the interaction between like sanctuary movement as a political movement and what you were talking about. Mm-hmm. And in terms of like, if you think about it, actually it takes a long time. It can take a long time for a church to decide whether they're going to become a sanctuary. And then even after that, if they decide to become a sanctuary, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take a person or a family. And then it takes another sort of like, amount of time. And in this process, while it's great that like a lot of discernment is happening and people are discussing and maybe coming on board, in the meantime, it's like sometimes the movement might be, losing its steam, or like the sort of the political meaning of immigration and why it's happening. It might be just like, reserved to this just like one family or one person without seeing a larger context. So I'm wondering what you're thinking about, like the potential for politicization or depoliticization.
Yeah, this takes me back to my thoughts of, when this started in the borderlands of Tucson, this was called a sanctuary ministry, not a movement. And I think there is a difference. I think there is a difference of a community who has spiritually undergone a process that says, who are we? What are we about? What's our identity? What are we willing to pay? Are we willing to pay the price for a certain kind of witness in this world or not? And if not, let's be honest about that, because one of the worst things that churches can do is mislead people, that they will walk with them. And then it's like the moment, you got to know from the government, I'm sorry, you have to leave. No. So that's real, genuine spiritual discernment that has to be done. Okay? That's a different timeline, as you said, from a social movement, from coalition building. Like those things can be taking place, but the urgencies of structuring a movement, in my perspective, is very different. And I think there's a need to collaborate, to think together, to interface, but at the same time to recognize that a church ministry of sanctuary is not and cannot be flattened out into a social movement, even if in time it really kind of either leads that or contributes heavily toward that, as it did in the 1980s. Movements, as we know, will come and go. Sanctuary lasted about 10 years. The church movement, some would say partly because it went so structured nationally, and it became such a formal process, and it became really kind of like an NGO, we could say. In the borderlands, it morphed. It did not end. It morphed into organizations that some of you students may have heard about, and if you haven't, I encourage you to look them up and go spend some time down there. No More Deaths is one of them. They operate summer camps. You can literally, like MASH, if you've ever seen that. I haven't, but I've seen some images of that. You literally live in a tent out in the middle of the desert, these humanitarian camps. Another one is called Tucson Samaritans. They go out daily in 4x4s and into the deserts and provide food, water, and medicine. And now with people crossing over, they've set up 2 more camps right at the border. I take faculty from Fordham to the border every March, and students as well. And we go right onto the camps, right onto the border and into Mexico. I just had one of my students spend 2 months at a shelter in Mexico right at the border. And, this work continues. But this is the transformation of sanctuary in the borderlands. It did not end with the national movement. And part of it, I think, the borderland experience was different than how it took off nationally as a movement, as a social movement. I mentioned Gandhi here, and that the way it was thought of at the borderlands was as this method of conflict resolution or the constructive program. You may have seen this kind of, I don't even know how to remember how it goes, the Gandhian quote of, be the change you want, or something like that, or build society from the ground up. It sounds pretty visionary and grand, but essentially that's what they were thinking down there. Like a simple act like providing refuge, it's not about defying the government. The government just is failing to do its job, so we will temporarily actually do what the government is supposed to do. We'll hold it accountable. And we have the backing, they felt, by like some international norms of what it means to be human. Sanctuary doesn't really, I would say, work to the fullest, but in the everyday, when society is still running, governments do their job, processes are working. But when society falls apart, when a system that theoretically is supposed to function fairly, whatever fair means, doesn't, and I'm thinking the fall of societies, Germany under Hitlerism. I mean, what takes the vacuum? How do you fill the vacuum there? It may be a social movement. It may be collaborations. That may not even be possible when societies fall apart, when states fall apart. Venezuela, go to Ukraine, wherever, when war happens and things no longer work, the institutions we built fall apart. What happens? That's when communities, at least from the vision of Sanctuary in the Borderland, that's when communities step in and become that cohesion, that glue among people, and saying, we will essentially be the society, the system that will save lives until a possible future when institutions exist again and can do their job. So again, just to your question, I think there are different social movements. They definitely morph into social movements. My work is focused primarily on saying to we, the church, we have a long tradition that we should probably not lose, because we're headed into a future, statistically speaking, where we're going to be confronted with, what are you going to do when mass deportations begin? And if it's not the first week of December, then maybe in 4 years, or 8 years, or 12 years. But I hope we've discerned, and some of you here who may be first, second, third, or fourth year students, but who may be leading local agencies or local governments or senators, wherever life takes you, what will you do? Where will you stand in these questions? So it's good to kind of think ahead about these things for when things fall apart, because they do. So, thank you.